Hello, my name is Zunair from Forum Test Prep. I'm a 132 scorer in CARS, and today we're going to be walking through this MCAT passage called Chinese Colonialism. So the first thing we're going to do is read through this passage carefully and highlight the most important sentence in each paragraph. So let's get started. I'll speed through this, and then afterwards we'll work through the questions one by one. So question 1 states, why does the author assert that the British Empire seriously damaged Chinese society? Option 1, the Manchu dynasty was good to its people. This is actually completely incorrect. In fact, the Manchu dynasty here is described as rotten. And then also, the Manchu dynasty is brought up at the beginning, where it says the Manchu government broke down under the blows of the British Navy. But again, it's never really stating that the Manchu dynasty was good to its people and that the British somehow impacted this good dynasty and brought on a bad one. Although the British Empire did damage Chinese society, it says no positive thing about the Manchu dynasty, so we can eliminate one. 2, the British encouraged other European countries to invade China. So in paragraph 2, they talk about the British and their relationship to the other European countries. By 1870, here, there were other European rivals to Britain in this plundering of China. Russia and France stole large territories. The British seized Burma. China was still a market. But again, these are described as European rivals to Britain. Rather than the British encouraging them to go, the British felt like their profits were being cut into by these other European rivals. So 2 is also completely incorrect. And finally, we have 3. The British used their navy to attack Chinese ports. And this is mentioned throughout the first paragraph. Besides the profits from this lucrative trade, they extorted millions of pounds as indemnities, seized Hong Kong and territory on the mainland, and opened Chinese ports to British trade by force. They talk about the steady drain of silver from China for the purposes of opium. The Manchu government broke down under the blows of the British Navy, and the Chinese official class were corrupted by opium smuggling. In short, the British Empire ruined the foundations of the once great civilization of China. Again, the Navy is attacking them, and that's causing this ruining of the foundations. So the correct answer choice is number 3, answer choice C. Question 2, which of the following consequences would have been most likely if no other European country but the British had a presence in China? A, China would have been able to resist the Japanese. Possible. B, Chinese civilization would have been preserved. C, the Chinese would have expelled the British. And D, China would have still been taken advantage of. So, although the British Empire ruined the foundations of the once great civilization in China, here at the end of the first paragraph, it talks about how by 1870, there were other European rivals trying to enter this plundering of China. Russia and France took some territories, the British seized Burma, and then eventually the Japanese stepped in as well. Later in 1894, the Japanese capitalists tried to annex a portion of China, but the annexation clashed with British and other European interests. The point being made here is that although British began this plundering of China, even if all the other countries had not stepped in, Britain would still be involved in the plundering of the wealth of China and ruining the foundations of China. Therefore, the answer choice is D. China would still have been taken advantage of, even if the other countries had not stepped in. Even if the British were the only presence in China, China still would have been extorted and exploited. Question 3 asks, which of the following assertions, if true, would most support the author's statement that the situation in China will no doubt lead to revolution? This statement is made here, right here, in fact. This situation is unsustainable and will no doubt lead to revolution. So it's referring to in 1894, the scramble for China entered its most dangerous but inevitable phase. The Japanese capitalists tried to annex some China, but they disagreed. Eventually, Japan got a port here and 34.5 million pounds in indemnity. To pay this, British and other European banks lent China 48 million pounds. This organized banditry threw an ever-increasing load on the millions of peasants out of whose produce came the taxes to pay these loans. Meaning, the peasants, based on the produce they're making, they're farming, the burden of the taxes is going upon them, which is the point made at the end. And then it says, this situation is unsustainable, will no doubt lead to revolution. With that being said, of course, the price of food is the most important part of this produce that's being made by the peasants. And so, if any of these assertions were true, which one would most support the other statement that this would lead to revolution? Many staple products for Chinese citizens now come from Europe. Okay, that would be interesting, but again, it doesn't tell us as to why that would inherently cause revolution. Buying and importing from somewhere else is not necessarily the catalyst to a revolutionary act. B. European trade tactics caused the price of food to rise dramatically in Europe. This assertion would support this idea that it's completely unsustainable. If the price of food that they're making for themselves keeps rising and rising and rising, this would cause a revolution, as this is completely unsustainable and would cause more taxes upon this produce that they're making. Okay, C. China's Asian neighbors also suffered under European rule. Again, this paragraph is not talking about any suffering from China's Asian neighbors. Rather, in fact, it's talking about one of China's Asian neighbors also being involved in the plundering of China. So C is completely incorrect. And then D, Chinese citizens in European-controlled areas are not allowed to own firearms. This would be interesting, but again, this has nothing to do with, number one, the debt, number two, the produce, or any of the taxes on that produce. So the best answer, therefore, is B. Question 4 is asking us, given the information presented in the second paragraph, which of the following statements could most reasonably be inferred? A. Russia and China did not attack Chinese ports. In the second paragraph, it says here, Russia and France stole large territories. It's possible that they stole these territories without attacking Chinese ports, but this answer is not strong enough by itself. B. Steel and iron prices were low in Europe at the time. It says here the Chinese people had to now give concessions and accept loans in order to buy iron and steel from Europe. It's possible that the prices of this iron and steel were low, but again, we're not told anything about before and after. All we know is that they had to take loans in order to buy these. China once controlled Burma. It references Burma and says the British seized Burma. The inference here that we can make by working backwards is that if the British took Burma, the implication is that Burma was previously run by China and then the British took it away from them. This looks like a good answer. D, China had no navy of its own. Again, we know nothing about the Chinese navy here. And if we know nothing, then we don't have the right to pick D unless we're sure that they had a navy or no navy or anything like that. But the best answer here seems to be C, China once controlled Burma, because we can infer that from this statement, the British seized Burma, implying that at some point the Chinese had owned Burma and the British took it from them. The point that the author makes about the possibility of a Chinese peasant revolt, paragraph 5, is most analogous to. So if we go to paragraph 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was this process which Lenin saw so clearly in 1908. In Asia, the peasants will aid the revolution. So when it says this process, we're allowed to work backwards and go to the paragraph before. The inevitability of revolution had been seen by others as well as far back as 1856. Marx made this statement. In its essential outlines, the analysis is today as sound as when it was made. But the rottenness of the Manchu dynasty was propped up by the military and financial support given it by the European governments, and the Chinese middle class, mainly commercial, could not provide the forces for the liberation of China. Okay, middle class couldn't help. As in Russia, it was the entry of capital and the consequent creation of a native industrial working class organized and disciplined by large-scale production that was to provide a means for the destruction of foreign capitalist domination in China. It was this process which Lenin saw so clearly. Small though the Chinese and Indian working class might be, as in Russia, it would have allies The hundreds of millions of peasants sucked dry before by Oriental feudalism, now driven to ruin by the burden which capitalist exploitation placed upon them, the exploitation that the colonial powers, and especially Britain, brought on Chinese peasants would lead them to revolt. So the author is claiming that because of the harsh conditions imposed on the Chinese by the British, this would cause the Chinese to rebel and revolt against them. And the question is asking us, the point that the author makes about the possibility of a Chinese peasant revolt is most analogous to. So we're saying the Chinese are being harmed by the British, and therefore the Chinese will group together and act out. A, the child development principle that kids who are forced to do too many chores are likely to act out. This sounds very similar to the fact that the Chinese are being forced to work for the British and then eventually will revolt. A is an interesting choice. B, the belief that the best way to keep employee morale high is to give them incentives like raises. Again, if the British were being extra nice to the Chinese, we might say this, but rather the British were oppressing the Chinese to get them to do what they want, so B is obviously incorrect and likely the opposite of the correct answer. The political science principle that single countries can rarely resist coordinated international action. This would be true if the Chinese somehow failed to resist at all. Then the statement could be made that the Chinese, as a single country, could not resist the European coordinated action, but again, it doesn't make this claim. The claim that is made is that the Chinese are oppressed and therefore rebel. So C is incorrect. The claim that wars that take place outside of one's country are likely to concern one's citizens. This is completely false because the Chinese peasants live in China. So therefore, they are concerned by this Chinese event. So again, D is completely incorrect. This leaves A, which is the best answer. The child development principle that kids who are forced to do too many chores are likely to act out is very analogous to the British who are exploiting the Chinese and therefore the Chinese rebel. So A is the best answer. Question 6 says, assume that a scholar is planning an extensive study of the modern history of China. The author of the passage probably would say that the most important task to be performed is blank. So the main idea of this passage that we've been given is that colonialism caused by the British and then later in the Europeans and the Japanese, led to the exploitation of China, and then this exploitation would later lead to revolution. So if we look at this, outside interests coming into China and oppressing the Chinese and later leading to the Chinese rebelling against the foreigners. Answer choice A says, examining how Chinese international relations affected the Chinese people. Obviously, this is very close to what the author is trying to explain to us, that the relations between Britain, Europe, Japan, and also with China are affecting the Chinese peasants, causing them to revolt. A is a good answer. B, comparing the behavior of various European colonists in China. Okay, that's interesting, but the author is not really working too hard to separate the European colonists within the occupation of China. Rather, it's labeling them all as oppressive and all as colonialists. Tracing the rise and fall of the Manchu dynasty, this could be interesting, but again, the Manchu dynasty is only brought up twice to say that the first time they were defeated by the British and the second time that they were rotten anyway. So again, this wouldn't be the most important task. Rather, the most important task would be the main idea of the passage, which is the occupation leading to the revolt by the Chinese people. D is studying the impact of international trade on China's economy. This could be interesting, and it's brought up a little bit, but the most important by far is connecting the foreign occupation to the oppression of the people and the oppression of people to the revolution. So the best answer would be A, examining how Chinese international relations affected the Chinese people, which references both the people revolting and also the foreigners coming in and occupying. Question 7 is asking us, how could the author best clarify the statement that though many European countries invaded China, the British did the most damage? So we have to see how the author themselves chooses to enumerate the amount of damage done to the Chinese by other companies and by other countries. So reading paragraph 1, it talks about how the British were using their military to defeat the Chinese military and then take over the ports. Paragraph 2 is talking about numbers, which is good. The British seized Burma, China was still a market, and between 1851 and 1855, again, this paragraph is the first time they mention other European rivals. Between 1851 and 1855, the excess of imports over exports from China was over 175 million pounds. So if they're referencing the other countries, and then they're saying that the total excess of imports was over 175 million, then the author could very clearly clarify that the British did the most damage by having the biggest trade deficit among the other countries. So if we look at the answer choices now, clearly they want us to use finances as a measure of damage. By comparing the damage done to Chinese ports with those done to landlocked Chinese cities, okay, interesting, but we're not comparing the Chinese ports to the Chinese cities. Rather, we're comparing the British to the other countries. So A is incorrect because it's making a comparison that's irrelevant. B, by comparing the fortunes of Hong Kong to those of cities taken over by the other European countries. Again, this is interesting, but one, we're not told the other cities taken by other European countries, besides just in passing and vaguely, so we don't know those cities. The author has chosen not to bring up those cities, so they must not be as important as a comparison tool. Comparing the size of the British military presence in China to that of other countries. This is interesting, but again, the main point of the passage is referencing the financial domination of the people of China. So although the military domination is interesting, it's not nearly as important as the fact that the British are forcing them to take loans on their own money, or having a big trade deficit with them, or leading to revolt based on the taxes of the produce. So D is the best answer by comparing how much of the European trade imbalance was with China, with Britain versus the other countries. Because we talk about the trade imbalance here when we bring up the other countries, so it's clear if the British had the most trade imbalance, likely they did the most damage.